Hello and welcome back to Fundamentals in Ecology. My name is Umesh Srinivasan and I am at the Center for Ecological Sciences at the Indian Institute of Science. And today in Fundamentals in Ecology, we will talk about community assembly, which asks questions in community assembly ask how is this community actually put together? Why are there a certain number of species? Why are some species common, other species rare? What is it that actually assembles this community, puts this community together, right? And there are various processes that can underlie community assembly. So we'll talk a little bit about those various processes that underlie community assembly, which is the processes by which you see a set of species co-occurring in space and time, but in other locations those species might not co-occur. So there are differences in the way that communities are assembled in various locations. This is a pattern of abundance of trees in the Amazon basin. So the Amazon rainforest, one of the largest rainforests on earth, and very species rich, lots of species of trees, plants in general, mammals, birds, arthropods and so on. What you have on the x-axis is species ranked by their abundance. So species that has rank 1 actually has an abundance that is the highest. So if you rank all the species based on their abundance, the most abundant species will get the rank 1, the next most abundant species will get the rank 2, and so on until the higher ranks are actually the rarer species in the community. And so this is what's called a rank abundance curve. On the x-axis is the rank of the species, and on the y-axis is some measure of population size, and that is on the log scale in terms of number of individuals or abundance. And so this is the rank abundance relationship. And what you've got is species going from rank 1, most common, to species going to rank 16,000, rarest, right? And what you see is that only 227 species out of 16,000, only 227 species make up 50% of all individual trees in the Amazon basin. We've seen this also with Barrow Colorado Island, where it is a subset of trees that are very common, make up most of the individuals in the habitat, whereas there is a much larger number of species that contribute much less to individuals in the habitat. So 227 out of 16,000, that is a very tiny fraction that's making up 50% of all individual trees in the Amazon. Close to 6,000 species of trees are expected to have populations across the Amazon basin of less than 1,000 individuals. So you've got 227 extremely common species and you've got 6,000 extremely rare species. So why do you see something like this happening? Why do you see that there are few common species and there are a large number of rare species? What are the mechanisms, what are the processes that lead to these patterns in communities? That's what community assembly is. 4 processes ultimately lead to changes in the presence or absence of species and ultimately in changes in the abundances of species. Now these processes are selection, drift, speciation and dispersal. Selection is when, for example, the environment, the abiotic properties of the environment, for example temperature and rainfall, allow certain species to exist in certain locations, those species that are physiologically adapted to those kinds of conditions, but not other species whose physiologies do not allow them to colonize those habitats, do not allow them to exist in those habitats. So that's one example of selection. We'll get into other examples of selection. Biotic interactions are also examples of selection, where if you have competition between two species, just the process of competition drives differences in abundances of those two competing species and therefore leads to some kind of community structure. That's again a selective force. That competitive interaction is a selective force in that uh, uh, in that community. Drift is randomness. It's random changes in species abundances arising from stochasticity or neutrality, or just random changes in birth rates and death rates can change abundances randomly, right? And so that's a random process, that's not selection. That's a process by which abundances and presences and absences of species can actually change at random. Then you got speciation. Speciation is the ultimate source of species, right? This operates over evolutionary timescales, and so whether a species is found in a community or not, uh, it depends on whether the species does exist, does come into being from speciation. So speciation is the ultimate source of variation. And then we've got dispersal, which is a very important driver of community assembly in many cases, where it's actually movement of species, individuals of species, from one location to the other. So they're colonizing and they're entering communities, and therefore that act of dispersal actually changes the structure of the community, because now you have another species that's in this community. Now, if you combine these four various forces, selection, drift, speciation, and dispersal, you get to various theories in community ecology and community assembly. Now, these four forces are have analogues in population genetics. So, if you look at this particular thing as asking how are species selected and how does the abundance of species change, therefore changing the structure of communities, in population genetics you're asking what is the distribution, what is the frequency of alleles of a gene, and how does the frequency of those alleles change in that population. And that's what population geneticists often are studying, which is how does the relative frequency of different alleles of a gene or multiple genes change in this population. And so in population genetics, the analogues are, again, you have selection on certain alleles. So if certain genes are responsible for very, very important functions of an organism, then you would expect that there would be very strong selection for there to be certain alleles of that gene, because it performs such an important function for the organism to survive. Drift is random changes in the frequencies of alleles in a population. This is especially true for small populations, where you can have changes in allele frequencies just simply as a result of random processes. Speciation, the analog in population genetics would be mutation, right? The speciation creates new species, mutation creates new alleles. So the analog there is mutation. And then you have dispersal, which is mirrored by gene flow, which is an individual from one population arriving into another population, bringing new alleles with it into this new population. So this theory of community ecology comes from concepts in population genetics. And if you combine these various four forces, these are the only four forces that can cause change in species occurrence and species abundances. If you combine these four in different ways, you can have different ways in which communities are assembled. For example, if you have only selection operating as a process, let's say there is a hypothetical community in which selection is the only process that is operating on this community. So it's only things like how are organisms responding to their environment, how are organisms responding to each other, how are they interacting with each other. That's purely selection. That is sort of traditional community ecology. Those models of community assembly are called niche models. Where there's only drift operating, what is happening is something called demographic stochasticity, and we'll see what that is. If you combine selection and drift, you not only have niche models, but you also have neutrality, randomness playing a role in influencing community structure, and those are called niche neutral models. If you combine selection and speciation, you get something called historical or regional ecology, which will be covered in a subsequent session. drift and speciation put together gives you Hubble's neutral model, and so on and so forth. Right? You've got various communities potentially being structured by various processes. The relative importance of selection, drift, speciation, and dispersal might be different in different communities. And so you might have some communities that are very strongly selectively influenced by selection, other communities in which drift or randomness plays a larger role, other communities in which selection and drift might be playing equal roles along with some influence of dispersal. And so we can't say that in every community the relative strengths of these mechanisms is the same. Some communities might have more selective processes, some communities might have more random processes. But this has been classically the way in which people have thought about community assembly. We've gone over the concepts of the fundamental niche and the realized niche, right? The fundamental niche determines where a species can exist. The realized niche is actually where the species does exist. And often in community ecology, because of the influence of research involving competition and predation, the fundamental niche is often thought of as being larger than the realized niche, in that a species can occur in this sort of geographical range, but it is limited to a certain subset, certain part of that geographical range, because competition or predation might not allow it to exist in the entire part of its range. So the first step in this model of community assembly, which is entirely niche based community assembly, which is entirely selective forces, selection operating to create or assemble these communities. The first step is that the fundamental niche of the species determines where a species can exist. So let's say you have here a pool of species. You have a pool of species. Each of these circles represents one species, right? Now, those species all arise from speciation. So obviously they're all connected through relationships between them. So speciation is creating this pool of species in the region, or the regional species pool. Now you have a regional species pool, and these species then differ in some important traits or properties. So let's say size is related to temperature tolerance. Yes, larger species are cold adapted, larger species represented by larger circles are cold adapted, species that are represented by smaller circles are more warm adapted. And so size in this case represents variation along some important trait, and that trait is temperature tolerance, where you've got these larger dots or larger circles representing cold adapted species. Now all of these species have evolved evolved as a result of speciation, and they are now in this larger region, in this larger habitat, in this larger regional pool of species. So temperature tolerance is a very important aspect of the fundamental niche of the species. Now in this larger region there is one habitat, yes, there is one habitat that is a warm habitat. It has higher temperatures than other parts of that region. So what happens in this case is that the habitat is now imposing a filter. You've got all of these species that vary in their temperature tolerances, but this habitat now, which is warm, allows only certain species to pass through that filter. It only allows the warmer adapted species to pass through the filter. So all the larger species, all the species that are cold adapted get filtered out of this habitat, and through the habitat filter only those species that are warm adapted can pass. And so what you're seeing on the other side of the filter is species that are warm adapted, represented by circles that are smaller than you would expect by chance alone, right? This is an actual selective force operating on the regional species pool. So this provides you with the habitat species pool. So once the habitat has imposed a filter, you have a set of species that is now part of the habitat species pool. However, at a very local scale, will 2 species or 3 species coexist? Will they be found together? Will they be able to coexist at very small local scales? That is then determined by biotic interactions between these species. So size of these species, size of these dots represents temperature tolerance, and temperature tolerance is part of the fundamental niche of the species. It interacts with the habitat filter to allow some species to pass through the habitat filter. And now you've got color or pattern that represents something else, some other trait of these species. So you've got these smaller sized species that have passed through the habitat filter, and now let's say the solid circles which are black are carnivores, the hatched circles are omnivores, and the open circles are herbivores. And so if competition is structuring these communities, 2 carnivores that are competing for the same resources, or 2 herbivores that are competing for the same resources, or 2 omnivores that might be competing for the same resources, should not be found together. They should potentially competitively exclude each other. And so therefore, what you get in the actual co-occurrences of species is that as a result of competition and competitive exclusion, the local community of those species of species will be represented by 1 species of herbivore, 1 species of omnivore, and 1 species of carnivore. So that's what selection through biotic interactions is doing, which is saying 2 species that are likely to compete, one of them will competitively exclude the other species, and therefore you're going to end up with the habitat species pool being composed of species that are similar to each other in some very important respect, in some very important characteristic of the fundamental niche of the species, because the habitat imposes some filter, allows only species that are similar in some respect to pass through, for example, temperature tolerance. And then once these species have passed through and are actually in the habitat, interactions between those species along some other aspect of the fundamental niche then leads to actual local communities and leads to the realized niche of these species. This is the classical sort of niche based approach towards community assembly. So as an example, you could say, for instance, here is a regional species pool of all of the bird species that are found in India, and they vary in their temperature tolerances. The larger the species represented by larger dots are cold adapted, the species represented by smaller dots are warm adapted. The Thar desert, for example, which is hot, imposes some habitat filter, allows warm adapted species to pass through that filter to form the habitat species pool. So you have a set of species that are actually found in the Thar desert, but do they co-occur? Maybe 2 species that have the same body size or similar body sizes are more likely to compete. Then this is just hypothetical, more likely to compete than 2 species that are of different body sizes. So at the local level, what you find is that communities are structured by body size, where you've got species of different body sizes co-occurring with each other, whereas species with similar body sizes at the local level are competitively excluding each other. Now, if you think of all the fields of ecology that actually have something to say about the way in which communities are assembled, then if you look at various fields in community ecology, for example, physiological ecology, spatial ecology, population ecology, ecosystem ecology, and community ecology, what you can think of are 3 things that drive community assembly. There are environmental constraints, there are dispersal constraints, and there are internal dynamics. So environmental constraints are things like the physiologies of species interacting with the habitat filter, right. So there are certain environmental constraints, and those constraints that the environment imposes allows certain species to pass through. Can those species even pass through that filter? Can they even move to reach a location that they can actually occupy based on their physiology? That is a very important constraint. These are dispersal constraints. So for example, if you took a bird from an Amazonian rainforest and you brought it to the Western Ghats, it might just be able to survive in the Western Ghats because the abiotic conditions to which it is adapted in the Amazon are very similar to the abiotic conditions in the Western Ghats. So it just might survive, but it's not been able to move from the Amazon to the Western Ghats. So it is constrained by dispersal. It's just not been able to move. And of course, when we talk about invasives and ecology of invasive species, that's something that we have done, which we've been able to overcome some of those dispersal constraints for certain species by moving them from one location to the other, and then allowing them to actually invade and become part of a community. Once environmental constraints and dispersal constraints have actually been overcome, then you have a set of species that are found together in the same location, and then it's the internal dynamics within that location, biotic interactions, that then influence how that community is structured. So if you look at this figure on the right, which shows you the large box, that this large box shows you the total species pool, or the TSP, at a very, very large scale, right. Say, let's say at the scale of the continent or the scale of even the globe. This total species pool is a result of speciation. This is a result of evolution and natural selection. That's how species are formed. So this total species pool comes about from speciation. Now, dispersal constraints, whether a species can move well or not, whether it's able to move to one habitat or not, creates a geographical species pool, or the GSP. Yes, and the environmental constraints, which is the properties of the environment, create a habitat species pool. Yes, or the HSP. We've seen that with something like this, with the process like this operating. The overlap between the geographical species pool and the habitat species pool, which is this area here, creates the ecological species pool, the ESP. And so, can a species pass through an abiotic filter? Okay. Can it move to actually reach and interact with that abiotic filter? That is dispersal constraints. The overlap between the two create the ecological species pool, and within this ecological species pool, the dynamics between species, let's say competition, predation, facilitation, commensalism, and so on, those internal dynamics actually create the actual species pool. Or at the local scale, do you see coexistence between species or not? And it's that coexistence between multiple species that then gives rise to the community. So this is purely niche based community assembly, but you can have random processes also influencing community assembly. One of those random processes is something called demographic stochasticity. What demographic stochasticity is random, non-deterministic. So this is not how is the fundamental niche of a species interacting with an abiotic filter. These are random, non-deterministic changes in population size that lead to random changes in species abundances, and therefore the distribution of abundances across various species, and therefore random changes in community structure. And when it comes to models like the theory of island biogeography and Hubble's neutral theory, it is actually this stochasticity, this demographic stochasticity, that is playing a role in playing a very important role in these models of community assembly. Now, how does demographic stochasticity arise? Where does it come from? Populations change in size as a result of 4 processes. We've seen 4 processes that can change community structure: speciation, selection, drift and dispersal. There are 4 processes that can change population size as well: birth, death, immigration and emigration. Immigration is the movement of individuals into the population, emigration is the movement of individuals out of the population. So population size at time t plus 1 depends on what was the population size at time t, how many individuals were added from birth and immigration, how many individuals were subtracted from death and emigration. Now, birth and death, immigration and emigration are both a discrete and a probabilistic event. So, for example, if the probability of producing an offspring is 0.6, then that is a probability that governs how offspring might be produced in that population. However, whether an individual is born or not is a discrete event. Either individual is born or it is not born. If the individual is born, it adds one unit to the population. If the individual is not born, it does not add a unit to the population. But there is a probability by which that individual could be born or not. So all of these events, birth, death, immigration, emigration, are both discrete events, but they're all governed by probabilities. And so even if all individuals have equal probability of birth and probability of death, the timing of reproduction, the number of offspring, etc., a lot of these things will vary across, will vary in the population. Yes, and because that variation is there, you can have random changes in population size arising from whether an individual is present in the is born or dies or immigrates or emigrates. And demographic stochasticity is a very important force in small populations, because small changes in random fluctuations in births and deaths in small populations can actually cause population size to go below what is a minimum viable population size, leading to extinction. And this concept of demographic stochasticity being very important in small populations has a role to play in conservation, and has a role to play in a lot of models of community assembly that invoke stochasticity and invoke this randomness and random fluctuations in population size, like Hubble's neutral model and the theory of island biogeography. Closely related, related concept in stochasticity is environmental stochasticity, which is random changes in population sizes through unpredictable fluctuation in the environment. So, if you have an extreme event like a cyclone or a hurricane coming through a habitat, then that extreme event could cause changes in population size that are actually unpredictable over the long term. So you could have events like floods and droughts and snowstorms and basically extreme events that can change population sizes and then affect community structure. Two aspects of the way in which we think of community structure is the concept of clustering versus limiting similarity. What clustering does is that it selects for species that share a certain trait, and therefore on that trait axis, for values of that trait, species will be clustered because their fundamental niche is interacting with the habitat filter. So here you have a lot of variation in the trait based on size, represented by size in terms of temperature tolerances, but when the habitat filter imposes this, when the habitat imposes a filter, it selects for species that are of similar temperature tolerances, species that have high tolerances for higher temperatures. So therefore, on the temperature tolerance axis, species in the habitat species pool will cluster. They will cluster towards, in this instance for example, cluster towards warm adapted species, species that physiologically can tolerate higher temperatures. Once they cluster on one axis of their fundamental niche, on some important axis of their fundamental niche, then because of competitive exclusion, because of competition, similar species will not be expected to coexist. Similar species will not be found together. And so therefore, competition causes a limitation on similarity. It limits similarity on some other axis of the fundamental niche. Let's say that is diet or body size in this case, right? So species that are represented by solid circles might be large species. Species that are represented by hatched circles might be intermediately sized species. Species that are represented by open circles might be small species. And then what you have at the local level, in the local community here, is communities that are structured through limiting similarity. Communities are structured by competitive exclusion, and therefore on the body size axis, these species will not be similar. These species will be, there will be some small species, some large species, some intermediate sized species, but similarity in species will in body mass will no longer occur, and that is what is called limiting similarity. So we've looked at community assembly, the importance of various processes in driving that community assembly. A lot more of those concepts will come in when we talk about things like biogeography and macroecology. But that was community assembly, speciation, selection, drift, dispersal, how these various processes might actually lead to a community of species being formed and cause variation in the abundances of these species. So next time we will talk about the distribution of communities, how a community is distributed across space. So thank you for joining today, and see you next time.